There were several factors, actually, that propelled Continuum. One of them was an image I kept seeing, which was the fish swimming in the ocean. The movement of the fish could not be separated from the movement of the ocean, that they were the same. And did the fish know that the ocean even existed? And the question was, are we swimming in an ocean that we are not aware of? Are there movements, are there activities that are lying? And I don't mean cells dividing. I mean definite activities that we are engaged in as processes that we do not know about. And so the inquiry of Continuum really has to do with the kinds of limitations that we accept without question. And so Continuum has been questioning those limitations for the last 40 years. The research of the work, even though I had a lot of training as a dancer, came when I was in a hut in Haiti. I had been living in Haiti for several years. I was a choreographer in a dance company, a folklore company. And I was very young at the time, and it was an incredible opportunity. But I was in this hut. I saw this woman dancing. As I watched her, I could actually see energy waves from the earth moving up through her body. And it was one of those moments where I got how the waves of the earth and the movement of her body were one thing. And I saw that unifying moment of the organism and the environment as one. And so I began an inner journey to really discover that the serpentine movement that we see throughout all of ancient dance is really the movement of water on land. You see, the body is movement. It already is movement. It's not something we do, it's what we are. We are movement. If the body is movement, then how can it be that somebody becomes paralyzed? And so I began to use paralysis as a kind of laboratory to go further and further into my understanding of movement. And so I went through a long period of deconstructing and of removing myself even from my own dance training and from anything that even looked familiar to me, and began to enter into undulating movements that were separate from folklore, that didn't have any connection to it of any kind. And as I went into it, I began to feel the nature of fluid itself. In other words, as you go further and further into that undulating mystery, your consciousness becomes shaped by it. And so you begin to see things or understand things that through the wetness that you would never particularly think of. I was very fortunate enough in the 70s to meet up with Dr. Valerie Hunt. She, at that time, was a professor of kinesiology at UCLA, and kinesiology is the study of movement behavior. And when I first began to think about working with paralysis, she thought I was crazy. She said, I don't know what you're going to try to prove. She said, you're going to work with polio? She said, once a person's muscles die, there's no way for those muscles to come back. So she gave a credibility, I think, to the research of the work with paralysis that very few scientists were even interested in doing. And so that became a big key of Continuum, is the issue around a flexible structure, not a flexible muscle, a flexible structure, a flexible human being. In other words, depending upon what the behavior of the fluid was doing would be how the structure organized itself. So if the cell is changing its structure, it means that inherently we have that capacity to shift our own form. Well, if I hadn't worked with paralysis, I actually would never have understood the problem of density. Because what density means, like when you see somebody who's immobilized, in other words, the question was, well, what is paralysis? If the body is movement, then what actually is paralysis? Well, you could look at it as extreme density, meaning that the fluid has coalesced within the tissue in such a way that it's immobilized, it can't move. In other words, if you forget that, if you do not get hung up on the fact that there's an insult to the spine, but you look at the overall communication, is that fluid resonating? You know, I started to tell you earlier that as you move more deeply into the realm of fluid, you really get that it is a resonant element, that fluid everywhere is in resonance with itself. It is an unbroken loop of intelligence. If you look at paralysis from the point of view of the fluid is locked. It is completely bound, it's compressed, it can't move, so there is no resonance. So the first thing you want to do is to establish resonance, and how are you going to do that? Person can't move, but they can move their breath. They can move their sound. And that's when I began to understand that as breath or sound gets introduced, those fluid molecules begin to move. The moment that they begin to move, the person is able, there's a change of density, and the person is able to move. A so-called paralyzed person can move from the fluid. In other words, you're bypassing the central nervous system altogether. The fluid is not bound in it. So you can transcend it and go right to the fluid, and the fluid itself will start to create movement. Now, whether that movement can become functional is a different phase of it, but you can initiate that awakening process through the activity of the fluid itself. First of all, sound is audible breath. So that's certainly a way of thinking about sound. I think that the other view of sound is that there is a vibration to the sound. For instance, in paralysis, the person's breath is frozen in their throat, actually. In other words, shock pulls breath up into the throat, like this. And so as long as the breath is up there, you're not going to have any movement. So all movement really is the movement of breath. We know that water carries sound waves much more efficiently than any other medium. So it seems that there is an amplification within the fluid system as the sound is being carried that creates that kind of stimulation that will begin, in a sense, the molecules begin to dance in that sense. So you have a dance of life taking place. In teaching Continuum, what we do is we set up a series of sequences. And it would include a breath sequence, possibly a sound sequence, and a movement sequence. And we do it as if you were playing a chord of music. So you play the chord of music that has different reverberations, different activities, different, let's say, gravity. And then you go into open attention where you listen to see what the organism, how is the organism going to respond to what you just did. I think that the deconstructing that takes place in Continuum, the kind of to allow a palate to grow. that is not just a performance palette, but is a palette of existence itself. That you, in other words, I call it a health artist, that an artist is not special case, but that you're in the creative life all the time. That you don't need a canvas or play necessarily, that you're in the creative inquiry all the time, and that your instrument is ready at any moment because you are fully inhabited at every level that you can possibly be. So although the Continuum is not movement training for actors, it is a world of movement that we inhabit that then can be directed into whatever particular interest you have. So it's not isolated for an actor or for a dancer or for this or for that. It's movement that goes from the movement of a cell to the movement of a poet.
The primary element that I tend to transmit to my students is that we are movement. That it's not so much about the movement that we do, but it is about the movement that we are. And sometimes it's easy to understand this intellectually, but experientially, it's a whole other ballgame. We understand movement as something that we do through space, how we travel through space. But to be movement, you can be so-called immobile. You're not moving through space, but there's a whole biological life going on within us. And not only within us, we are this biological life. And that's the movement that I aim to awaken in my students. So I would say I work with teaching about being movement, with tracking sensation, with sitting in open attention in a place of non-doing. Learning about leading and being led, how sometimes you may want to initiate a movement and then listen to how your body responds, and then let yourself be led by the movement that your body brings forth to you. Of course, this is all in the realm of being a fluid being, that we are primarily fluid. And I'm not talking about, as in dance, so often we talk about a fluid quality or a fluid style. This is not a style, this is a biological reality. And it's about tuning into the fluidity of our nature. And as fluidity, what that means is that we learn about being adaptable, flexible, able to shift and change according to circumstances, different circumstances. And that's another huge, I'll use the word gift of this approach, which opens up one's perception of not only oneself and how we relate to ourselves, but also how we relate to others, how we perceive the world. So everybody wants to understand, how do we breathe, the movement of the diaphragm, the movement of the rib cage, the movement of all the diaphragms, etc., etc. And what I found is through the simple act of sounding, which is one of the major elements that we use in Continuum in order to stimulate the movement of the fluids, to stimulate the movement of the tissue, that the sound, because the student is paying attention to putting the sound somewhere in their body, to appreciating whatever vibration, sensation that might be awakened, they don't realize that they are exhaling deeply and profoundly, and that actually they are beginning to soften or enliven their whole breathing mechanism so that they begin to actually feel their whole body as breath. And then when we're in performance, the body is even greater. And there's something fantastic. There's a huge communication, a fluid communication that goes on between sensations that I'm receiving from the audience. And when I say sensations, they're really subtle, right? It's almost like an intuitive sensation, a feeling that comes through the space. And sometimes it's a strong force that comes through me. Sometimes it's a stimulation that goes out to the dancers, something I get from them. It's a wonderful mix. And so I got to use this work in a very concrete way in performance, and that was marvelous. One of the most interesting processes I had was in working with a dancer choreographer, Pamela Newell, also in Montreal. And what was fascinating for that project is that she asked me to work with her because she felt that she was choreographing from a habitual place, and she wanted to break through beyond her habitual ways to find another process. And so our work together was really about what can happen, what we can do in the studio before she actually began the choreographic process. And there we worked with Continuum in so many ways as a personal research process, not a personal choreographic process. And we spent about 2 weeks playing through various games and exercises that included drawing and painting, using sound and movement a la Continuum, until something started to penetrate her system, and it was clear that through the tears and the laughter and more tears and much frustration, something shifted. A door opened, it's like the clouds broke through, the sun came in, and she said, "Linda, I think I'm ready to work on my own. You can go away, come back, I'll call you when I'm ready." And that's what happened. I would come back to the notion that I spoke about earlier, which is that movement is what we are and not just something that we do. Connecting to that place, we get to feel a deep, deep resonance within ourselves, that there's communication going on deeply everywhere. And when I say deep resonance, it's really profound, that not only is limited within the boundaries of my own body, but resonates with all other bodies.